أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والضحى والليل إذا سجى ما ودعك ربك وما قلى وللآخرة خير لك من الأولى ولسوف يعطيك ربك فترضى ألم يجدك يتيما فآوى ووجدك ضالا فهدى ووجدك عائلا فأغنى فأما اليتيم فلا تقهر وأما السائل فلا تنهر وأما بنعمة ربك فحدث صدق الله العلي العظيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم المحمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين سيما بقية الله في الأرضين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Brothers and sisters, dear comrades, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We're going to start by reminding ourselves of that very important verse, the verse for the tafsir for which we provided from Imam Khamenei in the previous session, where the Holy Quran states, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَا لِكُلِّ نَبِيٍّ عَدُوًّا. Thus we have established for every messenger an enemy. شَيَاطِينَ الْإِنسِ وَالْجِنِّ. Shaitans, devils from among the humans and the jinns. يُوحِي بَعْضُهُمْ إِلَى بَعْضٍ. So what they do is they inspire one another with decorative or flowery speech. Now, just as a kind of a prerequisite, I want you to understand that when you're reciting the Holy Quran, every time it's talking about the messenger, the Holy Prophet, or the messengers in general, it also applies to you. If indeed, inshallah, you are a believer and you've aligned yourself with the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, then it's not just saying that there's enemies for them, but there's also enemies for you from among the humans and the jinns. Why? Because when you align yourself, i.e., come under the wilaya of the messenger, you're going to share his enemies and his allies. This is a very important verse because it highlights for us exactly what's happening. The enemies are not just fighting on a physical level, they're fighting a very spiritual battle also. Recent events highlight this with utmost clarity. And what's actually scary about the world that we're living in today, that we've kind of stumbled into, is that the hujjah is really being completed on everyone. We're reaching a stage where people can no longer deny the reality of the existence of evil. People's eyes are truly opening to the reality of corrupt politicians. And when I say corrupt, I don't just mean, taking bribes. I mean corrupt in the sense that they know evil exists. They know the demons and devils, shayateen al-insi wal-jinn, exist. And they have chosen willfully, willingly, that path, that side. Okay, so it's not like us, me and you, and common people. What we think in our own innocence is if shaitan really does exist, then that proves that God also exists, and therefore I'm going to be a believer. This mentality is a Christian mentality. It's naivety. And because of that being naive, we fail to recognize the truly evil entities that exist all around us. All right, we cannot afford to be like that. And the Holy Quran is actually trying to wake us up to the reality that these evildoers are not like you and me. They are not like normal people. They're psychopathic. They know that evil exists and they choose it anyway. The Epstein scandal revealed many things. And we talked about this briefly in the previous session. But note also, many of you might have, your eyebrows might have been raised when you saw that it was leaked that the sacred cloth which covers the Kaaba that was actually leaked, and it was sent through UAE businessmen or businesswomen to that pedophile, Epstein. Now, to the lay person, it's just like, oh, that's interesting. Why would they do that? That's so strange. But for those who are more enlightened and understand the darker dimensions of the reality that we're living in, they'll understand that this is all to do with ritualistic acts through which they use the jinns and use sorcery to attack and to wage war against the Muslims. And herein, I need to open up the idea of how the jinns actually communicate, because this might not be apparent to many people. But what they actually do is they discuss things telepathically. Okay, this is a very important point. And if you understand this point, then many issues will suddenly start to make sense. The way that the shayateen among the jinn communicate is telepathically. All right. And the way that they do this is just to make it very practical for you. Whatever you bring to the very forefront of your mind, right? You concentrate on that thing or that word. That is what these entities will be able to pick up on. Okay. Do we find an example of this in Hollywood movies? Yeah, there's plenty of examples actually. But an example that comes to mind is the movie Ghostbusters. I can't remember if it's Ghostbusters 1 or 2. I think it was Ghostbusters 1. But if you remember in the final scene, they meet these demonic entities. Remember, they're trying to say that they're ghosts. They are not ghosts, okay? They're actually talking about jinns in the movie, demons. And that demonic entity tells them that you humans will now choose the enemy that is going to be the source of your destruction. And so the heroes, the protagonists, they try their utmost not to think of anything. But the fat character, who's, he likes food and stuff, he thinks he can't think of nothing. So he instead tries to think of the most harmless thing that he could think of. And what he thinks of is the Marshmallow Man. And it's a comedic element in the movie where that is actually summoned. So that entity is summoned in the form of a giant marshmallow man who goes on a rampage and destroys the city. Now, the movie is actually demonstrating for you how these entities actually communicate. All right. And this actually goes into the whole culture that we find rampant in America, which is the culture of seances. And you might have heard of seances, and this is basically where family members who have lost somebody dear to them will go to a certain mystical personality and they'll say, we want you to contact our dead uncle or dead spouse or dead grandparents. And then what will happen is they'll usually come into a dark room and then there'll be a crystal ball and all of this theatrical stuff. But what they're doing is they're contacting something which sounds like their dead relative. Okay. And don't think that this is all just entirely hocus pocus and it's all just complete fakery. No, there's a reality behind this because some people will go to these seances and they will say, I want to contact my dead spouse, for example. And then the person who is conducting the seance will bring information which is perfect, which nobody could have possibly known. And yet that person is speaking that information. For example, they'll say that this person says such and such thing. Only the person who's alive could have possibly known that about their dead relative. And yet they're bringing this information to the table. Now, how does that happen? First of all, they are not contacting the dead relatives of these individuals. They're actually contacting the jinns. And the jinns, because of their extensive lifespan, many of them have been alive while those human beings were alive. And those jinns understood things, they saw things, they heard things. And those jinns are now leaking information to the person who's conducting the seance. And that person is saying that information to the person who wants to hear from their dead relative. Okay, so they're not actually hearing their dead relative, they are hearing the words of the jinns. All right, and this is very important because throughout the world, not just in the Western world, but the Eastern world also, there's a lot of trickery that takes place. And if somebody comes to you with some information and you're like, whoa, how could this person possibly know that? Only I knew that thing. This must be legitimate. Cults are formed in this way. People are attracted to false prophets in this way because they think to themselves, how can they possibly have that information? They must have some link to a divine source. No, they're doing it through black magic. They're doing it through the jinns. And it's very feasible and very possible. The Holy Quran states, يُوَسْوِسُ فِي صُدُورِ النَّاسِ مِنَ الْجِنَّةِ وَالنَّاسِ. Shaitan, Iblis, what does he do? He whispers into the hearts of mankind from among the men and the jinn. This whispering partly is an indication of the means through which the jinns actually communicate, and that's telepathy. Okay. So you can actually experience this, and if you don't want to experience it, it doesn't really matter, because you have to understand that many of the thoughts that you have in your mind don't belong to you. They don't come from a divine source. Many of the thoughts that you have built your ideological foundations on are actually completely not the right path. They're not the straight path. They're not siratul mustaqim. And that's why so many people are being led astray, because they've actually been whispered to. And next time you get an evil thought, right? A thought that is telling you to do something sinful, telling you to harm somebody, telling you to hurt somebody, or telling you to commit any kind of sin against yourself or others. Just pause for a moment and try to imagine, try to locate where that thought is coming from. And my guess is when you do that, it's an exercise I want you to practice, especially in this month of Ramadan. It's a very good practice to do. Because what you're going to see, maybe after Ramadan, you'll experience it more, because much of the powers of the shayateen are completely inhibited and they're chained up during this time. But after Ramadan, certainly try it. My guess is when you try to do that, you're going to feel something around here-ish, around about here, somewhere around here, almost like it's literally whispering. Now, it's not a literal whisper, okay? It's not that your eardrum might not vibrate, because it's not a physical communication. And yet, that part of your brain which is activated when you hear something, I bet that's the same part of your brain that will be activated when you are told when an evil thought comes towards you. Okay. So the reason why this is important is so that you can learn to identify those alien thoughts and push them away, eliminate them, recognize that they don't belong to you or the Prophet or the Quran or the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. They come from a different source. Okay. Now, another way that they communicate is through symbolism. And this is really, really important. Okay. So there's essentially two ingredients to any spell. When the black magicians do this, what they need is two things. Number one is niyyah, intention. Okay. And that's the telepathic side of it. They need to communicate that. They'll do it often through their words, but it happens more here. The second thing that they need is a symbol. It is very important for them to have that symbol, because jinns are not so easy to communicate with. And oftentimes they won't be able to understand what you're saying. Beg your pardon. What you really need is a symbol in order to clarify the communication that you're giving to them. And this is why when you go to look at what the black magicians actually do, they'll often get a photograph of somebody, or they'll get a personal belonging of that person, and they'll do certain things with those objects in order to conduct black magic. Without those objects, and you might have seen, the voodoo doll shaped like a human being. You need to have something that indicates to the jinn which person you want to target with that. So bringing this back now to the Epstein leaks, when they were taking the kiswa, the cloth of the Kaaba, this was a symbol that they needed to communicate to the shayateen who we want you to target. Okay. Now, those symbols often need to be associated with a lot of emotional energy. So when you emotionally are attached to an object, that object has an attachment to you. And this shouldn't be too difficult for us to digest, especially in the modern world where we understand that, we're all created from atoms. And just by touching something, you are passing your atoms and a whole message onto that. And, the whole science of criminal forensics has proven that, you leave your DNA, you leave your traces of yourself everywhere you go. All right. And by the way, this also demonstrates why, in many of the folklore that we have, and Harry Potter, for example, and witchcraft, you see them using things like human hair or fingernails or feces. Now, when they take those symbols, some of those hexes and spells are lesser. Okay, they're not as powerful. And what they're doing is they're summoning smaller entities, and they just come along and they harm your life and they do all sorts of terrible things. And you need to learn how to fight back against that. We're going to be talking about that more in the next lecture, inshallah. But sometimes it's extremely powerful. Now, to do an extremely powerful spell, you need to also have a third ingredient, and that ingredient is sacrifice. There needs to be a sacrifice of something. When you see these things taking place in movies, there is a reality behind it, okay? And there is no denying that. The sacrifice needs to take place because jinns essentially feed off bacteria. First and foremostly, we need to understand that they feed off bacteria, microbes. That is their kind of blood cells. Just like we have blood cells and different cells inside our bodies, jinns also have quote unquote cells. Now, if you take a human blood cell and isolate it, you'll see that it almost looks alive. It has a nucleus, which is like the brain of the cell, and then that moves around and tells the cell what to do. It's almost like an entity in and of itself. Well, for jinns, they also have such blood cells, but those blood cells are scattered and they are microbes, okay? They're viruses, these bacteria. So first and foremostly, the third ingredient for those evildoers is to perform a sacrifice for that purpose, to bring about that mass blood cells for the shaitan to actually feed off. And secondly, it's what we talked about in the previous lecture, whereby they have to do something to prove to these conscious entities that, yes, I'm on your side. I'm willing to do something evil. I'm willing to, for example, sacrifice a human life. Now, in the modern world, where can you see an instance of great numbers of people being killed and it being an initiator to a great war against Muslims? Where can you actually see that? And I'd like to highlight the Twin Towers. Now, put your hands up if you have any doubts that Twin Towers, the September 11th was an inside job. Okay, so we have like one person who still doubts that September 11th was an inside job. I'm not going to go into it, but please, please, please do your research. Brother Kyle, inshallah, I'll take questions at the end. Do your research, find out, because all independent research indicates that 9/11 was an inside job. It was carried out by the enemies. And essentially, what they did is they pinned the blame on an entirely innocent man who is free from any of those accusations that they place on him. Okay, it's nothing to do with him. This was entirely the American establishment that carried out this act. Now, what people don't know, and I'm really surprised that many people don't know this, is that between the Twin Towers was a structure called the Sphere. And I think it was at least at a time, it was the biggest bronze structure in the entire world. Now, if you go to the architect of this bronze structure, imagine this tremendous sphere, and it was just rotating counterclockwise. If you can imagine that. If you go to the architect, he actually stated that this was built to represent what? The Holy Kaaba. That's right. The Holy Kaaba, our Qibla, the place where all Muslims throughout the world face while they are performing their prayers. The Holy Kaaba itself, the single most holy site in all of Islam, the site which was built by Ibrahim and previous to him, Adam alayhi salam. The sphere in the middle of the Twin Towers was actually built to represent the Kaaba. Now, what you have to understand is that the September 11th attack was actually a mass ritual. And at least we should entertain the idea that this was not just a physical false flag in order to initiate the war, but it was also a spiritual attack against the believers and against Islam. And it was a giant cataclysmic herald to all the jinns throughout the world to embark on a journey against Islam, to attack Islam. It wasn't just talking to the people and politicians of the world, it was actually heralding a greater spiritual battle against Islam. Now, to quote George Bush, this is the actual start of the quote unquote crusade against Islam. This is actually a new crusade that we are facing. And to many of the Gen Z who might be listening, you guys might not remember what the world was like before 9/11. Islam was growing. It's still growing, mind you. And people are still attracted to Islam because of the pure perfection and logical principles that it's based on. Monotheism is absolutely undeniable. And today, Islam is the only religion on earth which calls towards Tawheed, monotheism. So it's still attractive. But before 9/11, that attraction wasn't glazed with any kind of hostility or negativity. Islam was being explored. The numbers were increasing, and they needed to do something to attack Islam. There wasn't all this hostility, and the word terrorist was never associated with Muslims prior to this. It was always associated, to a lesser or greater extent, to non-Muslims, like, I don't know, like Russian terrorists or other types of terrorists or European terrorists. It was just an obscure word used to describe a certain person who has a political motivation to kill people. All right. It's after 9/11 that the entire world changed. And it's really that moment that started this entire weird world. And after that, you can see that time seems to have gotten faster and faster and faster. And these major events are actually leading up to the Dhuhr of Imam al-Hujjah al-Qa'im al-Mahdi alayhi salam. So what you have to understand is that, look, we look back in the past and we see certain civilizations carrying out rituals through which they would sacrifice human beings. And we think that that's not the kind of world we live in anymore. And this is, again, this naive side of us, which wants to just ignore the realities that we're actually facing. The ancient Aztecs, for example, if you go and look at the Mayans and the civilizations that lived in South America, they would actually perform ritual sacrifices, kill human beings. And the great Mel Gibson movie, Apocalypto, I'd recommend it. It's a really good movie, actually. It shows how they lived and what their societies were like. One of the things that they would do is they would take their human sacrifices up to the top of their pyramids and take out their hearts and roll their bodies down the steps of the pyramid. Why would they do that? And then you look at other civilizations, and this is a recurring theme that we find over and over and over again. Baal, for example, is another figure that we see in the Bible as well as the Quran. And this is indicating that child sacrifices were made. Why? All right, there is a scientific reason behind it, and there's a spiritual reason also. The scientific reason is precisely what I said. Those entities need something to feed off, and that the dead bodies provide a huge amount of nutrition for them. All right, and by presenting that, they're actually inviting those entities to come and do their bidding. And secondly, it's again showing that those people are willing to do what the shayateen want them to do, and thereby they come under their wilaya. Okay, so child and human sacrifices have been taking place, and you have to ask yourself, the reptilians, one of the reasons why they were expelled from so many countries is precisely this. Now you get into a lot of trouble, you get banned and blocked, and you get liable cases put on you if you try and say that they, the reptilians, are killing children. You're not allowed to say it. Why are you not allowed to say it? Because it's true. All right. And they've been doing this throughout history. And there's actually paintings made by Christians of the past which demonstrate this, which highlight this. And it's a warning for people in future generations. If you go and look in Western societies, particularly, although it's happening in the East also, a tremendous, unimaginable amount of children are just disappearing. Nobody knows where they are going. The Epstein case is just the tip of the iceberg. Huge amounts of children are being... Anyway, Hollywood, has it indicated to us, were there certain whistleblowers in Hollywood who tried to open this up and make people realize what the elites in the society of the West, particularly in America, are doing? Well, one example is Eyes Wide Shut, which I would not recommend, especially in the month of Ramadan. Please don't watch this movie. It's a 1999 movie, and it just has absolutely gruesome movie scenes in it, which just completely are revolting. But it was made by Stanley Kubrick. And Stanley Kubrick, according to a lot of analysts, was a director who was trying to reveal a lot of realities behind the American system. Now, this was 1999, just imagine. This movie actually depicts how many of the elite people in the American society, so the very rich people, the elite people who have lavish parties, are under the surface of American culture and their Christmas trees and all the decorations and all the materialism that they have on the surface. Underneath that, they are performing mass rituals and they are dedicating themselves to satanic entities. Mind you, Stanley Kubrick mysteriously died just before this movie was released. And apparently the movie was edited before it was released to the public. They couldn't not release it. They had to release it because everybody knew that Stanley Kubrick is working on this masterpiece of a movie. But what they did apparently is just edit out those parts which would have been too revealing. And just imagine that's before the Epstein files. That's before 9/11, okay? Another movie is Prisoners. I'm not sure if you guys have seen Prisoners. It's got Jake Gyllenhaal and Hugh Jackman in it. It's actually a really well-made movie. And I watched the movie a number of times before actually realizing what the movie is trying to say. The movie, spoiler alert, is trying to tell you that there is a cult. They have a certain symbol around their necks, right? They wear that symbol around their necks. And that cult has infiltrated into American society, and they are responsible for the kidnapping of numerous children. And towards the end of the movie, spoiler alert again, it shows to you that those people are actually making children disappear because it is their war against God. Now, who does that sound like? Now, if you're a Hollywood personality, if you want to make a movie, if you want to expose certain things, there are certain things that you can't say directly. You need to say them indirectly, otherwise you'll be knocked off, right? And so that's what the movie is actually trying to show you. Now, who says that, they are warring against God? And this is what you have to understand. All of this goes back to the reptilians. As we said in the first lecture, we're talking about the jinns as an element of that, but really it all goes back to them. And it says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أتدعون بعلا وتذرون أحسن الخالقين. Do you take Baal and leave the best of creators? That's Surah 37, verse 125, for those of you who want to go and confirm it. Okay, there are very few of these entities that are ever mentioned in the Holy Quran. Baal, particularly, is one of them. And this is, Allah just mentions him and moves on. And I believe Allah is trying to bring your attention to the fact that these people are actively worshipping and serving a particular enemy among the jinn, and his name is Baal. Baal is essentially Baphomet. What am I talking about here? What is Baal? What is Baphomet? You know that goat-headed entity that people think is Satan? That's actually Baal. That's what he looks like. Many of these Hollywood celebrities have seen him with their own eyes. And many of these elites are actively serving that entity, particularly that entity. In order to communicate with it, you need to provide child sacrifices. Man, I'm sorry. I know this is really horrible. And somebody told me yesterday that there might be children listening and I should tone it down. I don't know how else to elaborate on these things without just clearly spelling it out for you. This is what that particular entity requires. Okay. And if you can do that, then you get to be among the highest of the high in the American/Western societies. It's the only way. Okay, so why am I saying this? Let me just backtrack a little bit and go back to Aleister Crowley. One of the books, which is promoted by Aleister Crowley, is known as the Goetia, Gotia, Goetia. And the Goetia, and there's another book also known as the Lesser Key of Solomon. Now, if you go to these books, they will give you actual lists. This is the jinn. This is what its name is. This is what its title is. If you want to contact it, this is its symbol, and this is the sacrifice that it requires. Okay. And you turn the pages, and that's all it is. Every single one of them. You want to contact this one. This is for fertility. This one's for this. This one's for power. This one's for wealth. This one's for this. This one's for that. This is for material, for military success, etc., etc. And so that is what it essentially is. There are certain people who appeal to a certain entity for certain purposes. Maybe they just want to be higher up in the entertainment sphere, and so they contact that certain entity. Other people know they go for the highest of the high. And I would argue that the highest of the high among them is Baal, the worst of the kuffar among the jinn. That goat-headed entity. It is possibly the worst of the worst. And that's why people actually say that that is Satan or the son of Satan itself. Okay. Now, I'm going to elaborate on this a little bit more, but before I do, I want to emphasize this idea that your enemies are those who know these things. They know that evil exists, and they have consciously made the decision to serve them. Okay? The Quran, all the time, it's trying to make you awake to this reality. Most people are just completely naive regarding it. And they want to assume that most people are inherently good. They want to assume that if people knew that shaitans existed, that they would accept that God also exists, the angels also exist, and therefore become good. It doesn't work that way, especially with Satanists. وَلَا تَعْبُدُ الشَّيْطَانِ. Why does Surah Yasin, of all the surahs, why does Surah Yasin say that? Are you going to worship shaitan? Of course you're not. And yeah, there is another spiritual dimension behind it whereby, if you obey him in certain things, then you are worshiping him. But there's people who literally worship him. And I'm not going to recite the verses because I am aware of the time. But, look at Surah Baqarah, verse 275, where it talks about those who consume interest, usury. What are they like? They are like the ones who are touched by shaitan. Some of the translations say that they have been beaten into insanity by the shaitan. But being touched by shaitan or being initiated by shaitan, I would go for something more akin to that. Also, look at the verse just after that, where in verse 279 of Surah Baqarah, Allah says that, look, if you don't give up usury, what are you doing? You're going to war against Allah and His Messenger. Actually, Allah and His Messenger are going to war against you. And in another verse, this verse, when I first stumbled across it, I was just perplexed. I was like, wait, what did I just read? What is this? How is that even possible? Why is Allah even saying that? And that's the verse of the Holy Quran where it says, indeed, those who are an enemy to Jibreel, to the angel Gabriel. Like who? Who is that? Why would somebody be an enemy to Angel Gabriel? The Holy Prophet, I can understand. The Ahlul Bayt, I can understand. They're humans. But when you know that an angel exists and it's the direct communicative between you and Allah, how can you make it your enemy? And yet the Quran is highlighting for you that certain people actually take the angel Gabriel himself and the other angels as enemies. Subhanallah. And we know who those people are. The reptilians. The reptilians. That's literally what they do. Okay, so it's not the case, dear brothers, dear sisters, dear comrades, that somebody knows these realities and therefore he chooses to believe. Rather, there are many people who, after recognizing these realities, they become the worst of kafirs for the sake of the dunya, and they completely forsake their akhirah. We have to be the opposite, okay? Now, technology. I just have to touch on this, okay? And then we're going to go to the Q&A. All right. Technology there's an interrelationship between the jinns and technology. And I just want to allude to some of these realities before we move on. But for example, there has been a premise in the media, particularly in American media, whereby they show that technology is actually paving the way for demonic entities to enter our world, quote unquote. Doom, for example, which was an all-time favorite video game. We've all played Doom, right, guys? 1993. I mean, it defined an entire generation. It's probably the best, most impactful first-person shooter video game in the world. But the game actually depicts technology through which, I mean, it's so fascinating. Aliens slash demons, right? Because they're actually demons. The game describes them as demons, but they come from Mars. Isn't that strange? Why have they crossed over these two things? And the whole game is about you shooting them and killing them. And the biggest boss in that game is the cyber demon, which is essentially Baphomet. By the way, the game is full of symbology, right? The inverted pentagram and things like that. But the big horned entity, but this time he's shown having a metal arm and a metal leg. Why? Because the technology of America is actually being used not just to create absolute chaos and evil in the world through bloodshed and mayhem, but we also have to at least think, at least entertain the possibility that their technology is being used for a satanic purpose, a directly satanic purpose also, to actually be a kind of vessel for demonic entities to enter the world. And we've also given the example in the previous lecture of CERN. I ask you again, Go and look it up. CERN, opening ritual, tunnel opening ritual. Go and look it up. I had to go through like an hour or 2 hours of footage of that opening ritual just to see how satanic it is. And many prominent politicians, I believe even the Prime Minister of Germany at the time, was sitting in the crowd. And if you look at some of their faces, they are absolutely baffled at what they are seeing. They can't understand it. CERN and the scientists there, of course, deny this. And if you go online and you try and look it up on the surface level, it's all going to be denied. If you type it in ChatGPT, it's going to deny it. It's going to say it's got nothing to do with demons. And yet, I told you that they have a statue of Shiva, or the dance, the eternal dance of Shiva outside. But did you know also that a video was leaked where they showed hooded individuals apparently performing a human sacrifice right there? And CERN denied it. To quote that famous quote, don't believe anything until it's officially denied. The movie Gremlins, also 1990, Gremlins 2. Do you guys remember that at all? If there's lots of Gen Z in the who are watching right now, you're making me feel really, really old. Anyway, Gremlins 2 was a movie that I grew up with. One of the characters in that movie, by the way, it's just about these gremlins, these little creatures who go around creating absolute havoc. Gremlins 2, by the way, 1990. There's a lot of 9/11 symbolism in there also. Really strange. But anyway, in that movie, one of the gremlins, it becomes electricity. It becomes electric. And then it can actually infiltrate through the telephone wires, and it goes through the building, and it shows how it can actually appear on people's television screens. So there's that also. And then I told you childhood's end, right? And this is another thing that you just need to go and see for yourself to believe it. Childhood's End actually depicts Baphomet himself, right, with the horns and the red skin and the hooves, etc., etc. But how does it introduce him? Through technology, through a spaceship that's hovering above humanity. So I want us to just consider the possibility that AI is a stepping stone towards a vessel for these shayateen to actually communicate with us openly, completely openly. Because at the end of the day, the jinns, in order for them to physically manifest in our world, for us to see them and for them to physically interact with us and, actually do physical damage, they need that source, right? And that's why ancient human beings, they've always been sacrificing human beings so that they can take those microbes and physically manifest through them. Zombies also ties into that, because originally zombies was just this type of magic through which they would reanimate corpses. By the way, the shayateen, the evil ones among the jinns, they're going to be dealing with a particular type of microbes, and it's often najis, najasa. That's why they always blood, semen, urine, feces, right? They all, if you look at any of these disgusting individuals, they're always dealing with these types of things, najasa. And that's possibly part of the wisdom behind why dogs and pigs are najis, because when you bring such creatures too close to yourself, they are entities for the jinns to actually manifest through them, right? But the technology that the West has created has played a huge role in this. Now, I'm coming to the end because I know you guys are tired, and I'm very sorry for taking so much of your time, but there's another thing that I just want to allude to before we'll go to the Q&A. One of the ways in which they can actually, these sorcerers can actually see the entities that they are telepathically communicating with in order to confirm their existence is through scrying. Scrying. So when you were a child, you might have seen that, there's this hippie-like figure with a crystal ball, and they're going like this, and all sorts of shapes are appearing. Mirrors, but particularly black mirrors. All right. So they'll often use an obsidian black mirror. And what they do is when you look inside it, if there is an entity, you'll actually be able to see that entity. Now, In the previous lecture, we discussed how they have been normalizing this black magic through things like Harry Potter and making witchcraft and wizardry, sorcery really attractive, particularly to the youths, through novels and video games and all sorts. Okay, they've made it something which is commonly accepted. People don't know what they have accepted through doing this, but what they've essentially done is normalized it on a global, on a worldwide scale. Why? Something really bizarre is possibly on the way. Because what they've essentially done is put a black mirror in everybody's households. And you guys know what that thing is. It's in everybody's house now. It would have been so unusual just around 200 years ago to have anything that resembles a black mirror. And yet now we find ourselves in a world where there are black mirrors everywhere. And the Netflix series called Black Mirror is based on this idea, scrying. Black mirrors are an effective form through which you can see them. And if you don't know what I'm talking about television screens, and I'm talking about this, right? So if you want to, if God forbid there's an entity and you want to see it, oftentimes you won't be able to see it. So you'll look in your mirror and you'll be able to see it. Now, people don't do that. Whenever they look at their phones, it's never the black screen that they're actually looking at. And even if it is, they'll only look at their own reflection. But do you ever look behind you? Do you ever even think of doing that? I'm not telling you to do it, by the way. God, like, don't do it. I'm not encouraging this. I'm just telling you that they have normalized it to such an extent that there could be a sorcerer anywhere, and it won't even seem unusual to you that they carry a black mirror around with them in their pockets because it's completely normalized now, right? Again, I'm just saying to consider the possibility behind this. I'm not saying that this is set in stone. Okay, now I have to end on a little bit of a positive note. If you go to what the black magicians, what the sorcerers actually say, if you go to their books, one of the ways that they accomplish these feats that they accomplish and infiltrate into the highest levels of society is by allowing those entities to enter their own souls. And they basically become almost like puppets to those entities. It's an exhilarating experience, and it's almost like getting high, right? It's like taking drugs. Psychedelic drugs, by the way, is one of the ways that you can activate that part of your brain through which you can actually see them. And this has been done again through magic mushrooms and all sorts of things, and smoking certain substances in ancient civilizations. And that's why they started to worship these entities, because they literally saw them. So those idols that you're actually seeing from ancient civilizations, they're not just people's imagination. No, they actually saw those entities and they tried their best to depict them in paintings or in statues. But that's essentially what they're doing. Okay, so what they do, the top figures like Aleister Crowley, is they step aside, i.e., they empty their nafs. These people are highly dedicated to their field and their craft. And this is, when Imam Khamenei, he says that, look, listen, you people are sleeping while the enemy is not sleeping. And he's actually quoting Imam Ali alayhi salam when he's saying that. When you are sleeping, the enemy is not sleeping. The enemy is working very, very, very hard. And in order to accomplish what something like Aleister Crowley accomplished, it's no easy task. The rituals require you to fast at times to a ridiculous extent, to basically empty your nuts, to have no attachment to your own self. They have to rid themselves of that entirely. Okay, doesn't that sound similar to what we do? Right? The difference is that there really are angels and demons, and it really does depend which side you are working for. So what you have is an extreme level of elites on the side of batil, of falsehood, of evil, and they are working very hard. They're very dedicated. They are spiritually aligning themselves and taking out whatever self-sacrifices they can in order to accomplish their evil and demonic means, their evil and demonic objectives. And on the far other side, right, you have the elites of the best of the best of the best. And they also fast and they also empty their nafs so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can actually enter and take control of our own actions. That is what we were supposed to do, dear brothers and sisters. Fasting is actually one of the stepping stones towards that. There is a beautiful hadith, none other than the great mystic Imam Khomeini, the Arif, the actual Arif, the one who knew. He actually spoke about this hadith while many other scholars were afraid to quote it. And he said that one who prays the nafilah, Allah loves that person. One who endeavors to get closer to Allah, what will he do? He'll pray the nafilah prayers. Through that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will love him. When Allah loves him, he will become his eyes seeing, his ears hearing, his hands interacting. Right? So Allah becomes a part and parcel of who you are, and nothing can defeat that. There is nothing that can defeat that. Um, there is another point that I wanted to make about tawassul, but I guess we're going to have to leave that for next time. I always overgo my time. I'm very sorry, but these things, I need to cover them in depth. Otherwise, I just won't be able to get anywhere. God bless you. Jazakallah for listening. Wa sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.